Although the concept of ultimate accountability appears to result in the loss of free will, many monotheists argue that a lack of belief in one's accountability to God and a rejection of moral absolutes is what drives non-believers to indulge in sinful behavior, under the alleged false pretense that a God does not exist.
If God does not exist, then there is no basis for moral accountability. Traditionally, it's been held that God holds all persons morally accountable for their actions. Despite the inequalities of this life, in the end, the scales of God's justice will be balanced. Thus, the moral choices we make in this life are infused with an eternal significance. But if God does not exist, then what basis remains for moral accountability? Even if there were objective moral values and duties under atheism, they seem to be irrelevant because there's no moral accountability. If life ends at the grave, it ultimately makes no difference whether you lived as a Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted.
This view raises some very interesting questions about the theistic perception of morality. If the faithful truly believe God's law is necessary to guide human behavior, then let's imagine a hypothetical scenario where God does not exist and there is no final judgment or eternal consequence for one's actions. Under this scenario, do monotheists feel it would be acceptable to steal a car or rob their neighbor's home? If believers could know for certain that God does not exist, would it then be perfectly fine to murder someone in cold blood? If the thin veneer of God's moral law is the only thing keeping Christians and other monotheists from looting, raping, and murdering their neighbors, then it reveals something very terrifying about the theistic system of value. However, a divine, objective moral standard of morality not only fails as the basis from which to derive our true moral conscience, it cannot inform us about how we actually know right from wrong. God is not subject to reveal the inner workings of his moral barometer, nor is God required to explain his moral reasoning, no matter how benevolent or malevolent a command might appear. God's word is the law. Therefore, if God were to claim abstaining from adultery is morally good, then it would be so. Just as if God were to claim killing the children of his enemies is morally good, then it would also be so. Even though some of God's commands might appear to contradict our understanding of right and wrong, the objective moral worth of the action in question is always upheld because it comes from God. Period. Case closed. Therefore, objective morality cannot inform our actions. It can tell us if an action is right or wrong, but not why an action is right or wrong. Although the seventh commandment claims we should not commit adultery, it fails to provide an explanation as to why it is wrong in the first place. However, there are several stories throughout the Old Testament that tell of great leaders that were destroyed or lost their power because of adultery. In 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, the Bible recounts the story of King David and his affair with a married woman named Bathsheba. When David learns Bathsheba is pregnant, he devises a plan to send her husband Uriah to the front lines of battle, where he is subsequently killed, allowing David to marry Bathsheba and thus concealing her pregnancy. David's actions anger God, and as punishment, David's child becomes ill. For 1 week, David fasts and pleads with God, but to no avail. For on the seventh day, the child dies. Do monotheists base the decision to remain faithful to their spouse solely on what God commands? Is the lesson from David's story that committing adultery could result in the slow and painful death of one's innocent child truly a motivating factor for monotheists to refrain from committing this immoral act? Or rather, does the motivation to abstain from adultery go much deeper? The desire that drives two people to remain faithful to one another is not a conditioned response to a command, but rather is derived from our consideration of the other person's feelings, out of love and mutual respect. We remain faithful to our spouse not out of coercion and fear of God's retribution, but out of concern for the potential loss of trust that would result by cheating on one's partner. Here we can see that secular morality excels where biblical morality fails, because a subjective moral standard is informative, whereas an objective moral standard is not. The desire to be honored and respected informs our moral reasoning, that others are also entitled to honor and respect as defined by the Golden Rule. Therefore, subjective morality can provide an answer as to why it is important to be moral, whereas God's objective morality merely states the command and the resultant punishment. The non-informative nature of absolute morality is sometimes difficult to observe when it comes to an issue such as adultery, where the immorality of an action is obvious to everyone, regardless of whether or not one believes in a God. However, this distinction is not so clear when it comes to certain passages in the Bible that promote inequality or injustice against opposing groups of people. We have seen many examples of this earlier in the series, where the Bible promotes slavery and prescribes the death penalty for trivial infractions, such as non-belief and working on the Sabbath. However, objective morality's inability to inform our moral reasoning is most evident when Scripture promotes an action so heinous that if one were placed in a similar situation, there would be no other option than to disobey God's direct command. For a moment, imagine if God were to make a commandment that requires all believers to sacrifice their firstborn child in order to display their honor, devotion, and unquestioning faith in His Word. Even though believers are compelled to obey, how many will actually follow God's command, if to do so means they must knowingly go against their understanding of right and wrong? This serves to highlight a famous philosophical question posed by Socrates to the theologian Euthyphro. Originally found in the dialogues of Plato, the Euthyphro dilemma can be paraphrased as follows: Is moral goodness commanded by God because it is morally good, or is it morally good because it is commanded by God? The apologist William Lane Craig explains the dilemma and the argument against it.
If you say that the gods will something because it's good, then the good is independent of the gods. It's not dependent on them at all. But if you say that the good is whatever the gods will, then that seems to be an example of might makes right. They could have declared something totally different to be the good, and so it makes good and evil arbitrary, which seems wrong. And this dilemma is often pressed against those who believe that goodness and moral value is grounded by God. I think, however, that the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma because there's a third alternative. It's not the case that God's will something because it is good, nor is it the case that something is good just because God wills it. Rather, God wills something because He is good. That is to say, it is God's own nature which determines what is the good. God is by nature essentially compassionate, just, fair, kind, loving, and so forth. And because He is good, His commandments to us reflect necessarily His nature. And therefore the commandments of God and our moral duties are rooted in God's essence. They are not arbitrary. They are rooted in God Himself, but they aren't grounded in anything external to God. God is Himself the good, who is the source of our moral duties.
Is what Craig says really true? That because God's very nature is good, thus all moral goodness must emanate from God? God has historically commanded His followers to engage in immoral behavior. However, the fact that believers could engage in immoral behavior simply because it has been commanded by God shows us that the second half of the Euthyphro dilemma is actually true. Essentially, anything can be considered morally good so long as God approves. In Genesis chapter 22, God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. The Bible also claims Abraham dearly loves his son, and it would only be natural for Abraham to have experienced some kind of internal conflict with God's command. But in the end, Abraham is fully prepared to engage in the cold-blooded murder of his beloved child. It appears the simple fact that God commands an action makes the action acceptable, and the only conceivable explanation as to why it would be acceptable is because God has commanded it. As we can see, absolute morality is based on circular reasoning and therefore is completely non-informative. If our understanding of right and wrong is only supposed to emanate from God, it would seem that our internal sense of morality should never conflict with God's will. However, if Abraham could know that it is wrong to kill his child, despite the fact that God has commanded it, where is this sense of morality derived? Although Genesis 22 never lets on that Abraham has reservations about killing his son, The fact that Abraham dearly loves his one and only child seems to imply that he does. Any caring father placed in a similar situation would surely experience concern and hesitation about what he believes God has commanded him to do. However, perhaps Abraham did not have any apprehension or reservations about God's command. Maybe the scenario played out a little something like this.
Abraham! Lord! Abraham! Not interrupting, am I?
No, perfect timing. I was just telling my son about all the wonderful ideas you've had.
Good, because, Abraham, actually, I've had another one.
Another idea? An idea from the Lord? Oh, please tell.
Yes, I will. Okay, and do tell me if you think this is sort of, well, out of order, you know.
What?
Right. Well, my new idea is human sacrifice!
What?
You know, human sacrifice? I think you should kill someone. I think you should kill Isaac. So, what do you think?
Brilliant!
Really?
Oh, yes, Lord, another winner. Oh, I can't wait to see the look on his face.
You're sure you're fine with this?
Absolutely.
You would say?
I would say what, Lord?
Well, you know, if you thought I was asking you to do something, you know, wrong.
If I thought it was wrong, like I know, like I have any chance of forming an independent basis of right and wrong outside the instructions of some supervisory being. No, Lord, I am your bitch.
Yeah, okay, but...
Finish the pie, Dad. Where's the sacrifice?
Ooh, that's a good point. Where is it? Any ideas, Lord? Oh, wait, I remember. It's there.
What?
The Lord's new idea is that I should sacrifice you.
Me? Brilliant!
Yes, on the 5th day he invented the birds and the fish, and today he's invented me murdering my son. Another winner, Lord. You're certainly not tinkering with an already perfect creation.
Here's a nice stabby bit of flint, Dad.
No, hang on.
Right, brace yourself, lad.
No, wait. Look, wait.
Yes, Lord?
It was a test.
Oh, a test! Oh, what another brilliant idea.
He's so smart.
Did we pass?
Oh, you really passed there now, yes. Big tick.
There is no question that Abraham was a devout believer, but he was not a special case, for this story is applicable to everyone. Indeed, even if Abraham is a fictitious character, his story is still useful as a parable, for it provides an example of the level of devotion God expects his most faithful servants to possess. We are given this story for no other reason than the simple fact it displays the degree of faith that God requires of us. Therefore, put yourself in Abraham's position. Imagine if God commanded you to murder your firstborn child. Who among you would even entertain the idea, let alone attempt it? It is obvious no sane person would ever behave as depicted toward the act of murdering their own flesh and blood, even if they believe God's voice is directing them to do so. Whether monotheists want to admit it or not, everyone, both believers and non-believers, employ subjective reasoning in order to inform their understanding of morality. The fact we can still know right from wrong, despite what God commands, shows us that morality does not come from God, but rather from our own subjective reasoning. Morality comes from ourselves. Because secular morality is not comprised of rigid commands handed down from upon high, we can take the information we glean from our moral reasoning, as well as from scientific investigation, and apply it to a wide range of situations in order to assess the degree of moral relevance on a case-by-case basis. Among the mainstream followers of the monotheistic faiths, the moral implications of premarital sex, occasionally smoking tobacco, or even drinking alcohol in moderation are up for debate. But any sane, rational, self-respecting person that believes in a higher power would never sacrifice their children, even if it meant going against the explicit will of God.